Good afternoon, Mr. Reekie.
Hello.
Ms. McLennan.
Thank you, my Lord. Good afternoon, Mr. Reekie. Could we have document at Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 567, please? Do you recognise that document, Mr. Reekie?
I do.
Can you tell us what it is, please?
That's the design review that we were speaking about before lunch, performed on behalf of the Scottish Futures Trust by Atkins.
And do we see from the cover sheet that it's dated the 12th of December 2011?
Indeed.
We could go to page 571, please. I'm just going to read out from the text under the heading Summary and Recommendations. The purpose of this independent review was to assess a design brief for the project to replace the Royal Hospital for Sick Children, the Department of Clinical Neurosciences, on the Little France site. The review assessed the capacity of the project to deliver value for money by meeting the strategic aims of the programme, by making best use of space and opportunities for maximising sharing with other assets, by minimising the whole life costs. The recommendations are intended to indicate actions which will help to de-risk the specification and the reference design as the project progresses towards outline business case and the preparation of tender documentation, and to improve value for money. Does that accurately summarise what you understood to be the purpose of this report?
Yes.
It said there that Atkins assessed the design brief for the hospital. What was comprised in that design brief?
I can't tell you exactly what was in the design brief, but that would be the expression of the requirements for clinical services and other services to be delivered by the building. What it was trying to achieve, brief.
And that introduction also said that the recommendations were in part intended to help de-risk the specification and the reference design as the project progresses towards outline business case and the preparation of tender documentation. What do you understand there to be meant by de-risking the specification and reference design?
I think de-risking the specification is probably not language I would have used myself, but it's about the idea of making sure that the reference design as expressed appeared to be meeting the brief in as efficient a way as possible, such that it didn't have to go through any cycles or iterations during the progress of the project beyond the OBC and into the preparation of the tender documentation, which would have potentially led to delay and rework.
What risks might arise in relation to the specification and reference design, which it would be within the remit of Atkins and the SFT to raise?
If it didn't look like the spatial representation in the reference design was a diagram, a spatial arrangement that met with the design brief overall, there might have to be iterations in that as the project went forward.
So would the particular risks then be associated with delay and cost of having to revisit the design?
Yeah, or even progressing further and not meeting the overall requirements for the project to be able to deliver the capacity of clinical services that the design brief expressed.
You go forward, please, to page 576. There's a heading 2/3 of the way down, reference design. And Atkins say this: at the point of our review, the reference design was relatively underdeveloped considering the stage of the project. There was no clear and settled building diagram. This means that, and there are 3 bullets, there is not an understanding of how departments can be developed in detail within the current blocks, and so on. Are you able to say what state or stage of development the design had reached at the time of this review?
Not in detail.
In overview?
I would guess that it looks like they had potentially an understanding of the schedule of accommodation, but not yet at the level of getting to the detailed interaction of how the spaces fit with each other and go next to each other. So it appears to me that they were almost at a concept stage of having a schedule of accommodation and a diagram of the building, but not quite yet understanding how the adjacencies, so the ways that the individual rooms and the departments interact with each other, didn't appear yet to be wholly resolved to meet the clinical needs.
And is the understanding that you're expressing just now based on what you've just read there, or your recollection of the position at the time?
Very much based on what I've just read there.
Do you know to what extent the design at that stage included specification of details relating to technical standards for ventilation, for example?
No.
Could you go please to page 627? We see there a table headed up Technical Cost Summary 4.
Yep.
Are you able to explain what this table shows?
That's a cost breakdown structure for the elements of the building and what we call a rate and a measure. So the amount of that element expressed in square meters, and the rate as in the general cost per square meter of that element, which multiplies together to form the overall cost of the different elements. So how many square meters of frame and helipad are there, and what's the price per square meter for frames and helipads in general? If you multiply those two together, you get the total cost of the helipad, and if you add those up across all the different elements of the structure, you get to a total cost for the building. The number of square meters is specific to the spatial design of the building, and the cost per square meter is taken from reference material that generally quantity surveyors hold for the market costs of different elements of buildings.
Okay, and do you see at item 5.7 there's an entry for ventilating systems?
I do.
And a cost given there, and a cost per square meter. And you've explained the generality, but in relation to that specific example, could you just explain to us what the basis for that cost estimate would have been?
No.
Is that because you don't know?
I don't know.
Do you know whether an assessment of the cost of ventilation would have made assumptions about the extent to which the ventilation system would comply with technical guidance such as SHTMs?
I would imagine that at this stage of development, the rates, so the costs per, were very much based on what was normally expected for the sector. So in as much as hospital ventilation generally complies with the standards for hospital ventilation, you would expect that those rates would incorporate compliance with specification, but it wouldn't go down to anywhere near the level of detail of individual items of compliance with specifications. And indeed, the rates here, for example, may well include projects in different jurisdictions like England that have slightly different technical standards, but at the level of the generality of a hospital ventilation system costing this much per square metre, that's all lost in the rounding, if you see what I mean.
If we go forward, please, to page 636. See a section headed up reference design. And then just below that, the aim of this section of the review is to assess value for money in the creation of the environment for patients and staff.
Sorry, 1 second. Up a wee bit. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
And then reading down, there's a subheading AEDET. And then what it says there is the Achieving Excellence Design Evaluation Toolkit, AEDET evolution, is published by the Department of Health.
Yep.
Are you familiar with the AEDET?
No.
Okay, and taking that answer into account, of course, if we move forward to the next page, at page 637, the text there, paragraph 7.2.2, says NHS Lothian undertook an AEDET on 12th of August 2011, and so on. Then there's a table below that, and do you see at line F, there's a line marked engineering, and then at the end it says 0 out of 5 scored. And then below that, section 7.2.3, text reads, a number of elements are unable to be scored at this stage because the design is insufficiently developed. In particular, performance, engineering and construction cannot be scored at this stage. Is that something that you're able to comment on?
Well, the design development of the reference design and the work that Atkins was doing was spatial, based on the amount of space to carry out a function, and the cost element was about, we've talked about already, that the design that it was looking at was very much a spatial design to understand whether the number of rooms, the size of rooms looked reasonable to carry out the volume of clinical activity across the specialties that was being discussed. So I don't see that would have required engineering design in order to make that assessment.
And then if we move forward, please, to page 644. Paragraph 7.8, building services and progress to BREEAM. Text reads, the approach to building services design and progress towards a high BREEAM score was not assessed, as it anticipated that this will form part of the technical monitoring of the project by both the Scottish Government and HFS. Do you understand what the reference to technical monitoring is referring to?
I would imagine that that is the processes of design assurance that might be run by Health Facilities Scotland that we've referred to previously. But as you say, it wasn't in scope for this particular exercise.
I can't remember if you mentioned it this morning, but are you familiar with a process called the NDAP, the NHS Design Assessment Process?
I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with it.
Could we go, please, to Bundle 3, Volume 2, at page 650. And is this a document that you recognise, Mr. Reekie?
Yes.
Can you explain to us what it is, please?
This is a document that sets out Scottish Futures Trust approach to, as it says, the validation of revenue-funded projects, which includes those in the MPD programme, through the key stage review process spoken of. Okay,
so is that the same key stage review process that we saw outlined in the Scottish Government's funding letter for NPD projects?
Yes, it is.
And we see there on the front page that this is dated December 2011.
Yep.
would this be the guidance that applied to the key stage reviews undergone in relation to the Sick Kids project?
I would expect so. I can't tell you whether there was a further iteration before the end of the last review of the Sick Children's Hospital project, but I think this was the one that applied throughout.
If we go, please, to paragraph 1.2, which is on page 652, just picking up the paragraph 4 lines from the top, the sentence begins, SFT's role. See that?
Not at the minute. It's very... Yes.
SFT's role is to carry out a high-level review of the outline business case. In relation to centrally funded health projects, SFT may conduct a detailed review of the proposed design and specification and provide comment to the Scottish ministers or project sponsor in order to form their own approval processes. SFT's role in that regard is part of the general project support function, does not form part of the KSR. KSR process starts after the outline business case or sector-specific equivalent has been approved. The reference there to the detailed review of proposed design and specification, is that referring to the same sort of process as Atkins carried out?
Yes.
And then if we could move forward, please, to page 653. In paragraph 1.3, first paragraph, just reading from part of that, the reviews will be carried out at no cost to the procuring authority by the member of the Scottish Futures Trust team who normally provides support to the project, reviewer. The process involves the assessment of the readiness of projects against a pro forma list of questions at each key stage of the procurement. Then moving on to paragraph 2, the reviewer will also prepare a short report and make recommendations as to whether, in his or her view, the project is ready to proceed to the next stage of procurement and what actions may be required to achieve the appropriate state of readiness, either to proceed to the next stage or in advance of the next review. And then if we go on to paragraph 1.4 on page 654, just reading from there, SFT staff members supporting individual projects will at the start of each project jointly review the list and explain to project teams what information the reviewer requires to see in order to recommend projects for approval. The overall role of the reviewer is to ensure that best practice and relevant guidance are applied and to advise projects in this regard throughout the procurement process. Now, those passages that have been read out, would those all have applied to the key stage reviews carried out on the Sick Kids project?
Yes.
And there was a reference there to the reviewer's overall role being to ensure that best practice and relevant guidance are applied. What's best practice and relevant guidance referring to?
In relation to the non-profit distributing aspects of the project that SFT was overseeing.
When you
so
say
the commercial terms and the value for money.
And if the review is to be carried out by the SFT team member who ordinarily supported the project, how independent or objective could the review be?
The idea was to have the reviewer that's supporting the project team and working most closely with the project team complete the elements of the key stage review so that we didn't overly burden the team that was being reviewed, and we're trying to move through the process, as we've all talked about, at the most possible pace consistent with getting the right outcome. So we're trying not to overburden the team being reviewed by asking the reviewer to fill in the paperwork and complete the reports. asking questions where necessary of the project team and asking questions of the project manager as required. What we then did was pass that completed review onto a member of Scottish Futures Trust senior management team who hadn't been involved in the project to review the completed form, such that we brought that level of independence that might not otherwise have been the case had it just been the member of the team who spent their time working, as in this case Donna Stevenson did, with that project.
So if there were flaws in the approach which had been devised by a team, including the SFT team member, how likely would the review process be to detect those flaws?
I find that a very difficult question to answer. I would say that any review process is quite likely to catch flaws in processes, but no review process is 100% infallible. So in relation to the aspects that the review was covering, which was the value for money, the compliance with the MPD principles, the readiness to move to the next stage, the documentation, I would say that it was well set up to be able to capture those things. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because the team member who was with the project team completing the form meant that it wasn't just the view of the project team who may be trying to get through a review that was filling in the form. It was filled in by part of the team that was doing the review as well. So we captured, in my view, a better set of information in those documents by having someone from our team who was close filling in the form. We weren't just relying on what someone else had said about the project. And then by bringing that third-party scrutiny from a member of SFT's leadership team who had relevant experience to question the what had been completed in the form and to question the reviewer as to what they were seeing on the ground, I think that was quite a good review process, although I absolutely would not say it was infallible.
If we just go back briefly to page 653, the final paragraph there says that projects that are also subject to gateway reviews will in future follow a single integrated project assurance model process. This process is currently under development. Do you know, well, first of all, did that merger of review processes happen?
The integration of reviews between KSR and Gateway was something that was happening during 2012, 2013, and I believe it didn't lead to a single process, and the points of potential overlap were Gateway 2, which aligns with the very first key stage review. But I would say Gateway 2 is probably closer to the OBC, whereas the pre-OJU key stage review is after OBC. The final gateway in the Gateway 3 is pre-financial close, which is the same as the pre-financial close KSR. So there is a potential for two reviews at that final stage. And the idea of the integration was to put the onus on the reviewers, the Gateway team and the SFT team, to make sure that they coordinated those to the extent possible and didn't again overimpose on the project teams.
And to what extent was the review process merged in that way for the Sick Kids project?
I'm afraid I can't remember how that went all the way through the process of saying that process of bringing the two together and developing the integrated project assurance model was ongoing during 2012, 2013, which is exactly the period that this project would have been going through its procurement and therefore its key stage review process.
Could we go please to bundle 7, page 463? And do you recognise this document?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
And can you explain to us what it is, please?
It looks to me like it may, I'd have to maybe go into the document itself a wee bit.
Well, if it would be helpful, perhaps with liaising with the document reviewer beside you, you could scroll through it. That would help you remind yourself about it.
Yeah. Could we keep going? It looks like it's Scottish Futures Trust's report on the back of the Atkins Design Review.
Okay, so to whom would this report have been addressed or sent?
Scottish Government Health Directorate.
And what was the purpose of the report?
To draw together SFT, the findings of the review, provide input to the scrutiny of the outlined business case, I would expect. I'm maybe not as familiar with this one document as I should be.
Do we take it from what you said that this is not a document for which you were responsible?
It was not one that I wrote.
Oh, okay. Do you know who would have done?
I can't recall which member of the team wrote this document. I'll almost certainly get the hang of it if I spend a few minutes with it, but I can't. Just off the top of my head, it's not something that I'm familiar with every paragraph.
Well, I'll go through it and read out some paragraphs, and we'll see where we are once that's been done.
Thank you.
At paragraph 1.4, it says, SFT engaged Atkins consultants to act as its consultants in relation to the review. Following the review by Atkins of a significant number of background documents and 3 structured interviews with members of NHSL's project team and its advisors, a workshop was held, and so on.
Yep.
Then if we move over to page 465, there's a heading, Review Recommendations.
Yep.
2.1, the Atkins report contains 20 principal recommendations which SFT endorses.
Yep.
Then 2.3, a number of the recommendations raise issues for NHSL to consider when further developing its reference design and authorities' requirements for the purposes of the ITPD documentation, which will be finalised and issued before competitive dialogue commences.
Yep.
In this regard, the delineation of negotiable and non-negotiable elements will be of importance. Now that final sentence there, the delineation of negotiable and non-negotiable elements will be of importance.
Yep.
What's your understanding about that point?
Well, once the reference design had been developed, that provided a design that would meet the authority's requirements. And it was important for bidders to know what they could change in relation to that design and what they were not able to change in relation to that design in order to put in a compliant tender. So a mandatory element or a non-negotiable element, I think the 2 words were used at different times, was something, a characteristic of that design that was required to be incorporated into the bidder's tenders in order to be compliant, and a negotiable item or a non-mandatory item was one which was an example of how the brief could be met, but the bidders were free to adopt a different approach to meeting that requirement in their tender submission.
And what was the SFT's interest in getting that delineation correct?
It was a matter of value for money, because if the bidders were able to meet the requirements of NHS and deliver the requirements of the project in a design that may be more space efficient or cost efficient, then to the extent that was possible, they should be able to use that, their own innovation, to bring greater efficiency to the design process. So we were interested in ensuring that the mandatory elements, to the extent possible, only represented what was clinically required for that clinical functionality that we've talked about, operational functionality, and in this project, some other elements that related to the interaction of the building that was going to be built with the other buildings on the site, notably the connection to the existing Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. So we wanted to allow for innovation amongst bidders for as much as possible other than those core elements.
And then if we move forward, please, to page 466. Paragraph 3.2, SFT will provide this report to SGHD as part of its comments on the outline business case which NHSL is to submit. 3.3, subject to approval of the outline business case, SFT will then carry out a pre-OJAU key stage review, at which time SFT will consider progress which NHSL has made in addressing the 20 recommendations. 3.4, it is expected that all of the recommendations will be capable of being addressed by the time the ITPD documentation has been finalised by NHSL. So, do we see there that the SFT were to check on progress made in following the recommendations?
Yeah.
And that the recommendations were expected to be addressed by the time that the ITPD documents were issued?
Yes.
And if we go forward, please, to page 468. This appears to be Appendix 2 to the report we've just been looking at. And do we see there a list of issues and then beside that, list of recommendations?
Yep.
Yep. And if we just scroll down through that list, are those, as far as you know, the recommendations from the Atkins report?
I believe so, yeah.
And if we go, please, to page 473, do we see that some of those recommendations relate to the reference design?
Yes.
And I mean, the inquiry and the parties can read the detail of that for themselves, but there's no comment there about the ventilation specification or compliance with guidance.
No, it's speaking to the spatial elements of the reference design that we've talked about here.
Yeah, thank you. Could we go, please, to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 655? And you should see in front of you there an exchange of emails between, well, amongst a number of parties. The email at the bottom is from Donna Stevenson of the SFT, Jackie Sainsbury at NHSL, dated the 22nd of December 2011.
Yep.
And her email has the subject heading RHSC/DCN Project SFT Design Review. And she says, Jackie, further to earlier correspondence, I'm pleased to enclose our report on the project review, the final version of the report from Atkins. So those are the two documents that we've been looking at earlier today.
Yes.
And then the email above that is from Donna Stevenson to Mike Baxter at the Scottish Government. And I'll just read what she says to him. Mike, in August, Colin, Viv and I met with Bettina and Heather of A&DS, Architecture and Design Scotland, and Peter Henderson of Health Facilities Scotland to discuss the relationship between the SFT design review and the input of Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland to the project review. At the meeting, we agreed that we would send A&DS and HFS the independent design review report once it was completed, and they will consider the gaps which still need to be covered. At the time we sent on the remit of the review to Heather, in view of the time which has elapsed since then, as the costing information became available, I do not know whether matters have developed. Perhaps when you're back after the festive season, you could let me know whether you wish me to send on the report or whether you wish to do so in the context of any other discussions which may have taken place. Were you aware of what happened in response to this email and what was being suggested in it?
Yes. So that was the discussion earlier in the year. Looks like it was a discussion between, ourselves, SFT, and ANDS and HFS to talk through the interaction or lack of interaction between the design review that Atkins were carrying out on our behalf and what you've already mentioned are the review processes that ANDS and Health Facilities Scotland undertake. And now that our report done by Atkins had been completed, Donna was offering to Mike Baxter, who sat in health in Scottish Government Health Directorate, to send that report to him so that he could potentially, if he wished to, pass it on to those other parties. I believe that was then done.
Yes, indeed. As you say in your statement, it's paragraph 165, page 297 of the witness statement bundle. You refer to comments made by ANDS and HFS on the Atkins report. If we could go, please, to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 883. Is this a document you've seen before?
Yes.
We see it's headed up with the logos of Health Facilities Scotland and NHS, NSS, and that it's headed up HFS comments on the RHSC/DCN independent design review carried out by Atkins for SFT. Just reading from there, it says the following comments relate to the Atkins independent design review dated 12 December 2011. Drawings and detailed information on which the Atkins report was based were not available to HFS other than a set of proposed reference design drawings dated June-July 2011, previously submitted to Architecture and Design Scotland for their design review. Do you know what the purpose of that review by HFS was?
I think it was done because they were invited to do so by Scottish Government, but I don't know exactly what instructions or questions they were asked.
Were you aware of HFS being asked to carry out that review?
I don't believe I was aware of this at the time.
Would it have been a matter of interest to the SFT, even if not you, perhaps somebody else at the SFT?
Well, you could see from the previous correspondence that we were keen to follow up on potential for Health Facilities Scotland and Architecture and Design Scotland to want to be aware of the review that Atkins had done. I think for our purposes of assessing the value for money affordability that we've talked about, the Atkins review had done that job. So in as much as it was useful to others to review it, that was fine that they had a look at it, but it didn't increase it wasn't necessary for SFT's purposes.
If we just go further up that bundle to page 880 and page 881, It just starts at the bottom of page 880. There's an email from Peter Henderson, who is described as the principal architect at HFS, to Donna Stevenson at the SFT, copying in various others. He says, Donna, as requested by Mike at last week's meeting, my comments on Atkins' report are attached. These mostly reinforce Atkins' comments rather than adding anything new, as I haven't seen the latest detailed drawings or specification information. If they have not already prepared one, I think it would be useful for the board/design team to produce a comprehensive schedule of the guidance documents they're following in order for future bidders to be clear on the standards that they're expected to comply with. Do you know why Mr. Henderson was giving those comments to Donna Stevenson?
No, I guess it's something that he thought of while he was reading that paper, because it didn't contain all of those sorts of things, and he thought it would be useful if that was done, but I don't know why that comment would have gone to Donna Stevenson, other than that she was the person that passed him the Atkins material.
Who would you consider would be the appropriate recipient of that message?
Well, it speaks to what he thinks the board and design team should do, so I would think that the board or the design team.
Okay, and then if we go further up, again, the next email straddles 2 pages, but at the bottom of page 879, we see an email from Heather Chappell, who appears to be from Architecture and Design Scotland, and she's replying to Peter Henderson, Donna Stevenson, copying in various others. And if we could just read partway through her email, this is on page 880, she says, we understand it is expected that the recommendations in relation to the reference design and the brief will be addressed by the board prior to the ITPD. Then she says, we would be happy to do various things. At the second bullet, she says that we'd be happy to help the pre-ITPD KSR consider if the design recommendations, being those most within our area, have been addressed before the reference design scheme and briefing documents are presented to bidders. And Pete has suggested that HFS can carry out a high-level check of the reference scheme against guidance at this point. This is not being done by others. Now, that offer being made appears to be an offer of assistance in relation to the pre-ITPD key-stage review. Do you agree with that?
Does.
Are you aware if input from HFS was obtained in the context of the pre-ITPD key-stage review?
Don't believe it was, but I can't be 100% confident.
And then reading on, third bullet, she's saying we would be happy to help with evaluating the bidder's responses to the developed design brief for our part in relation to the design quality standards, etc. And HFS could carry out a high-level check against guidance if this is not being done by others. And there is no explicit reference there to a key stage review, but
it does say it's in help with evaluating bidders' responses, so it looks like it's a help with evaluation during the procurement process.
Yes.
Oh, yeah? I missed that answer.
It looks like that final bullet there is referring to the potential for Architecture and Design Scotland to help with the evaluation of bids during the tender process.
One of the other key stage reviews occurred at the close of the competitive dialogue procedure, is that right?
Yes.
But do you know if any input was taken from HFS at the stage of the SFT's key stage review at the close of the dialogue?
I don't think so, but I don't know why that's relevant to this.
Well, if we take the previous bullet, makes an offer of assistance from HFS in the context of the pre-ITPD key stage review.
Yeah.
Then the third bullet makes a similar offer of assistance from HFS in the context of bidders' responses. Whilst there's not an explicit reference to the key stage review in that relation to that offer, it simply prompted my question as to whether you knew if input from HFS had been taken at the stage of the SFT key stage review at the close of the dialogue.
Again, I very much doubt it would have been, and I think that those offers in relation to what are quite technical elements of design would be not something that we would have been covering at the level of the key stage review at either the pre-ITPD or the close of dialogue key stage review. So it wouldn't surprise me that those offers were not taken up.
Okay. And then if we just go to the top of the page 879, there's an email from Donna Stevenson to Colin Proctor and Andrew Bruce. Are Mr. Proctor and Mr. Bruce both at the SFT?
Yes.
And what she said, so this is an internal SFT email.
Yeah.
And of course, you're not a party to it, so it's perhaps a little unfair to ask you about it, but you can tell us whether you know or don't know. But the email says, Colin, perhaps we could pick up on these design issues and the process for interface with Architecture and Design Scotland and HFS when we meet on Thursday, discuss the KSR funding conditions points.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that issue and how it was taken forward within the SFT?
I don't, but I haven't got any information in SFT that it was taken forward substantively. But I think our view at that stage was that SFT did one element that we've talked about at length of design review that fed into the outline business case review by Capital Investment Group of Scottish Government Health Directorate, and that ANDS and Health Facilities Scotland provided separate advice to that business case process. And we were content that our process had been done and that we had shared the results of our process with the other parties who may have similar processes. So we thought that at that stage that we'd done enough to satisfy that interaction and interface, is my understanding.
Could we go please to bundle 7, page 493? Now, you should see there, Mr. Reekie, that this is bears to be a letter to Mike Baxter. If we scroll down through it to page 502, we see that it's a letter from you. Do you see that?
Not quite got there yet, but yes, indeed.
Is this a letter that you recognise?
Not the detail of it, no.
Okay. If we just go back to page 493, please, final paragraph on that page, just reading from there. Mm-hmm. SFT have also carried out a project review, having engaged Atkins as consultants for the review, and SFT's report, to which the report from Atkins is appended, was issued to the board and copied to you on 22 December 2011.
Yep.
Annex A to this letter comprises a list of the recommendations of the project review with comments from SFT on the board's responses to them. The recommendations of the project review form the basis of a number of comments in this response to the OBC.
Yep.
And then we read forward to page 496. About 2/3 of the way down that page, there's a recommendation, which is that the funding conditions include a provision that all of the recommendations are to be implemented by the board to the extent not already dealt with, and that the SFT at the pre-OJEU KSR consider the progress which the board has made to that time, and at the pre-ITPD KSR, consider whether the recommendations have been satisfactorily addressed by the development of the reference design and authorities' requirements, and as reflected in the ITPD documentation. The reference there to funding conditions, what does that refer to?
That would have been the letter from March 2011 that we reviewed earlier on, I would imagine. And that funding conditions letter would then flow through to, I think, the approvals that were given by the Scottish Government Health Directorate, and that they might refine those conditions into a specific letter or condition relating to this individual project.
And then if we go forward to page 503, do we see there annex headed up recommendations of the project review, and, and columns listing recommendations, then at the right hand side SFT comment at 12 January 2012?
Yep.
You see that? Now if you go to page 511, and if you just scroll over from page 511 into 512, do we see there the recommendations relating to the reference design? And then column at the right hand side to that says SFT to review the authority's construction requirements at the pre-ITPD KSR and obtain confirmation from the board that this issue has been satisfactorily addressed. So do we understand from that that one of the things that SFT was going to do at the pre-ITPD key stage review was to review the health board's construction requirements?
In relation to this recommendation, yes, and to confirm that the board had this, that recommendation had been satisfactorily addressed.
And as you fairly point out, the recommendations relate to specific points on the reference design. Was the SFT's review of the construction requirements go beyond that, or was it to be confined only to those issues?
I wouldn't expect us to do anything beyond reviewing the recommendations that the Atkins report had made, and I would expect us to do that at the level of a key stage review through a combination of seeking assurance from the board and potentially reviewing the individual documents.
Can we go please to bundle 5, page 61? Now, this is a page with 2 emails on it. The bottom one is from a Thomas Brady at Davis Langdon to various individuals, none of whom, as I understand it, are at the SFT. So you may not have seen this before. Do you recall having seen it before?
I think I've looked at it as part of this bundle.
Okay. Well, the email is headed up NDAP review, and it says, the reference design team have been trying to ascertain for some time now if we need to complete an NDAP, NHS Design Assessment Procedure, review of the scheme. David was advised that a meeting was to be held on 20th of January between SFT, HFS, A&DS and the Scottish Government to discuss if the NDAP review procedure was a requirement for NPD contracts. Can either of you raise this with BC, which I think may be a reference to Brian Curry, the project director at NHSL?
That seems reasonable.
To allow the date to be arranged. Then the email above says, meeting did take place and I spoke to Peter Henderson at HFS. No clear way forward came out of the meeting, but he did say that everyone present appreciated the RHSC/DCN project had been reviewed to death. I was unable to get a definitive answer from him for the last RDT meeting, which I think is probably reference design team meeting, as he wanted to discuss further with SFT. I think it now falls to NHSL, probably Brian, to move this forward with SFT. I imagine he's reluctant to raise the issue in case it prompts a further round of review meetings. Were you aware of uncertainty or debate about whether an NDAP was required for the project?
No.
Were you aware of a view that the project had been reviewed to death, as it's put there?
I wasn't aware of a sense that it had been reviewed to death, but you'll recall the discussion of the interaction between the key stage review and the gateway review process, so I could understand why the project team might feel that they had been subject to a number of reviews, but all of the reviews had particular purposes that were designed to, in the end, help meet the requirements of the project and deliver value for money in a workable project.
The email finishes up with a line that it now falls to NHSL to move this forward with SFT. Do you know if the matter was taken up with the SFT?
We don't have any recollection of it having been further taken up with SFT.
And was it a matter for the SFT to decide whether or not an NDAP was to take place?
No.
And if it wasn't a matter for the SFT, do you know who, for whom it was a matter?
I believe that would have been the Scottish Government, because they were the party that, as we've looked at the documentation before, wrote to health boards asking them to do those sorts of reviews under specific sets of circumstances.
And does it appear from this that there was some confusion about the roles of the different parties in relation to an NPD?
It does.
Could we go please to page 5, sorry, bundle 5, page 117. Again, these are emails to which you're not a party, so you may not have seen them before, Mr. Reekie. The bottom one is from a David Stilley at Mott MacDonald to Brian Curry, copied to various others. Subject, again, NDAP review, the date 2nd of May 2012. Brian, further to yesterday's discussion, I have spoken with Peter Henderson at HFS, who confirmed that the requirement for NDAP review on NPD projects has still to be discussed with SFT. However, he was of the opinion, given the review by Atkins at OBC stage, there is no likelihood of further review until at least a full business case stage, and even that at the moment is doubtful. He agreed to take this up with SFT and Architecture and Design Scotland, but the focus at the moment is on the community care facilities, and the NPD projects have not featured on recent agendas. Can you comment on what Mr. Stilley says there about the involvement of the SFT?
Much the same as my previous comment, that we believe we're not aware of any further discussion with ourselves, and it wouldn't have been a matter for us to decide about the NDAP review in relation to NPD projects. Had anyone asked us about that, we would have directed them towards Scottish Government.
Okay. And what's recorded in this email is that an opinion was expressed that because the review by Atkins had taken place, there was no likelihood of further review until later on. And that opinion is being expressed in the context of a question about whether an NDAP review is required. Do you have any view on the extent to which the fact Atkins had carried out their review had any bearing on the need for an NDAP review?
From what I understand of the scope of an NDAP review, it's very different from the scope of the Atkins review. So I would not be of the opinion that because Atkins had undertaken their review, it would affect whether an NDAP review should or shouldn't be done.
Could we go please to Bundle 3, Volume 2 at page 889? And in the bottom half of that page, there's an email from Donna Stevenson, Colin Proctor, dated 26th of April 2012. Again, you're not a party, but this is an exchange between two people in the SFT.
Yep.
And if we just go down to paragraph 8 of Ms Stevenson's email at page 890, and sorry, to put this in context, she says at the outset of her email, Colin, as arranged, I note below the key issues which we discussed at our meeting with Peter and Andrew yesterday. I've left a copy of the plans on your seat for the meeting at 10 a.m. Now, it's not clear whether that Peter is you or Peter Henderson. Do you know whether it was you?
No, but given the context of this has been an internal set of correspondence and discussion, it might well have been me.
Okay. And if we scroll back down to paragraph 8, the issue that she's noted here is, has NHSL now addressed all of the recommendations of the project review as brought out in the Atkins report, bearing in mind that the reference design team will be disbanded at the issue of the OJEU? SFT will look to NHSL to confirm that these have been implemented at the pre-ITPD KSR. There's a reference there to the disbanding of the reference design team. What do you understand about that?
At the point that the project went into procurement, the reference design would have been completed as far as it was going to be taken. So I would imagine that the NHS Lothian decided that they no longer needed the services of the designers who had been developing that reference design.
And then going up to paragraph 6, it says, given the departure of the reference design team, is NHSL satisfied that it has sufficient technical support to evaluate the bids and sufficient information is available to enable that process to be carried through effectively? What's the issue being referred to there?
That if NHS Lothian were going to disband the team, which would have been the technical people involved in developing the design, that once they got further through the procurement and had technical proposals made back to them by the bidders, that in some way they would need to have the capacity and capability to be able to review those tenders as part of the procurement process. So it would have been necessary for them still to have some people with that level of technical understanding on the team somewhere. That needn't necessarily have been from the same people that did the reference design, but it seems relevant that as some technical people were moving on or being disbanded, that it was important that NHS Lothian maintained some element of technical capability in order to be able to assess the bids that came back.
And then returning again to paragraph 8, Ms Stevenson's final sentence is, NHSL should note that SFT is not signing off on the design. What do you understand her to be referring to there? That's
the fact that we had the design review undertaken for us by Atkins to do the job it was intended to do on value for money, the overall size and scope of the project, and that the recommendations in that report had bearing on the ongoing design and the reference design, but just because we were accepting that the recommendations had been undertaken does not mean that SFT was in any way capable of or did sign off or approve the design in any way.
Does the fact that she saw fit to make that point explicitly suggest that there was some room for doubt or uncertainty about that point?
I think it suggests that she's a good lawyer by training.
Could we go please to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 896. And do we see there that this is headed up Action Notes, date 11th of May 2012, and just above that, Project Steering Board number 13.
Sorry, my fault, Mr. McLennan. The page?
Page 896.
Thank you.
Rod. And then amongst the list of attendees, there are various names that will be familiar to people who have sat through these hearings, but one of them is you. So
Yep.
do we take this then as minutes of a meeting of the Project Steering Board on the 11th of May 2012?
We do.
And if we go to page 897, we see there approach to reference design, paper as tabled was approved. And so do you recall that meeting approving a paper about the approach to be taken on the project towards the reference design?
I don't recall it, but I don't doubt the minute.
If we go please to page 892, this is a paper to that meeting of the Project Steering Board headed Reference Design. If you scroll down to page 895, we see that it's been prepared by Brian Curry, the Project Director. Do you recall that paper, Mr. Reekie?
I'm afraid I don't. No.
Don't. But perhaps it's possible then to take this at a very general level. Did the SFT approve the approach taken to the reference design which had been devised for and on behalf of NHS Lothian?
I wouldn't have said that SFT approved the approach to reference design. I know that we were involved in discussing it, and I can see there that the project board, on which I was at the meeting, did approve it, but I wouldn't say that SFT approved the approach to the reference design.
This comes back to a question we asked earlier about the role of the SFT at these board meetings. Do you recall if you were involved in a vote about whether to approve that paper? I
don't recall any votes at project board meetings.
If you had any difficulty with the approach proposed, would you have raised it at that meeting?
I believe I would.
Do you recall doing that?
I have no recollection of the meeting.
Bear with me a moment, please, Mr. Reekie.
Of course.
Now, it's not the intention at this hearing of the inquiry to consider what the ITPD documents actually said or the detailed state of the reference design at that point in time. Those are matters which will be addressed at future hearings. I would like, if I can, though, to ask you about your understanding of what was intended at the time that the steering board made that decision about the reference design. And maybe you don't recall, if you don't recall the meeting itself, but I'll put these questions to you anyway. Were you aware at that stage that NHS technical guidance on ventilation existed?
Yes, I would say, yeah.
There was some uncertainty, but just at a general level.
I've known that NHS has a suite of technical guidance in relation to engineering systems and would have expected ventilation to be one of those pieces of guidance. Okay. I wasn't aware of the detail of what it said.
Okay. Were you aware of any intention by NHSL to derogate or depart from or to fail to comply with any such guidance?
No.
Were you aware of any intention by NHSL to require bidders to derogate or depart from any such guidance?
No.
If there had been any such intention, would you expect that you or somebody else at the SFT would have been made aware of it?
Not necessarily, no.
And if I could then turn to the question of the environmental matrix, and again, I'm just going to ask you at the level of generality rather than the specifics. Are you familiar with the term environmental matrix?
In the context of this project, I've seen it and discussed it, yes.
To what extent is it a term which you recognise as a concept from the from PFI and PPP projects generally?
My experience of PFI and PPP projects has been on the financial and commercial side, not on the technical side, so it's not something of which I'm specifically aware.
Have you ever come across the term environmental matrix before outside of this project?
Not that I recall, but I wouldn't, it's not within my general scope of work.
Just to understand the question and answer, I take it, Mr. McLennan, that what you're putting to Mr. Reekie is whether he's aware of it as a term of art, in other words, something having a special and well-recognised meaning.
Yes, my lord, that's what I was attempting to put to Mr. Reekie.
I'm sure you've succeeded very well, but just want to make sure I'm keeping up.
Yes. I'm obliged, my lord. Be clear, that was the intent of my question. Are you aware of it as a term of art in the context of PFI and PPP projects?
No.
One final point, Mr. Reekie, and it concerns something said in your statement. If we go first of all to paragraph 129, which is on page 278 of the statement bundle. You refer there to a draft invitation to participate in dialogue volume 1. You say, we have a copy of revision K, but not the final version of the ITPD. And then there's a document reference given, but that document reference appears to be to a revision A, whereas what you refer to in your statement is a revision K. Can I just clarify that the document you're referring to there was a draft of the ITPD rather than the ITPD actually issued to the bidders?
I am aware that we had a copy, and the document that I was referring to at the time I was reviewing this to make my statement was revision K. I guess we referred to that because it was revision K. I don't know whether that became the final version or whether there was another version after the revision K that became the final version. All I know is that I had K and I couldn't be sure that it was the final version.
Yes. Okay.
I'm not the document controller though, unfortunately, so I need to be a little bit careful what I say on version control.
Okay. And then moving on at paragraph 147, which is at page 290 of the bundle. What you say there is, in the version of the ITPD revision K that we have, the list of deliverables in Appendix E that were stated to be mandatory included the environmental matrix, even though it was not included within the definition of operational functionality. Now, all the preceding paragraphs all put that in context and explain it. But all I want to clarify at this stage is that you're referring to the draft of the ITPD that the SFT had, and that you're not purporting in your statement give evidence about what the ITPD actually issued to bidders said about that subject.
I'm not. I'm merely saying what the revision K that I was looking at when I made that statement said.
Thank you, Mr. Reekie. I've got no more questions for you. My Lord, as Previously, I've attempted to give effect to lines of questioning identified by core participants, but Your Lordship may wish to check that I've done that to their satisfaction.
Does anything arise from the questioning of Mr. Reekie that anyone would wish to draw to our attention? Right, I take that as a negative. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Reekie. Thank you for coming and giving your evidence, but it's now concluded, at least for this stage, and you're free to go. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank
Reekie.
you.
Now we have one witness for tomorrow, but perhaps Mr. McGregor is taking that witness.
Mr. McGregor tomorrow, my lord.
Right. And 10 o'clock, as we understand it.
Yes, indeed.
Well, thank you very much for your attendance, and we'll see each other at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you very much.